An 8-year-old girl's simple question silenced a crowded town hall and left Donald Trump sharing a deeply personal story about faith loss and redemption. What happened next moved everyone to tears. Emily Carter's fingers traced the worn edges of her grandmother's Bible, each crack in the leather a familiar comfort as she sat in the last place she expected to be on a Wednesday evening, the fellowship hall of St. Mark's Lutheran Church in Shreveport, Louisiana. The room, usually filled with the aroma of post-service coffee and cookie platters, now carried the sharp scent of anticipation and hand sanitizer. Secret Service agents stood like shadows against the cinder-block walls, their earpieces occasionally catching the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. "Are you sure about this baby?" her mother Rachel whispered, adjusting her nurse's badge that she hadn't had time to remove after her double shift. The metal clip caught on her faded blouse, the one she kept meaning to replace but couldn't justify with the rising cost of Emily's orthodontics. Emily nodded, her 8-year-old determination momentarily masking the tremor in her hands. The question she'd been practicing for weeks felt heavy on her tongue, like the communion wafers Grandma used to share with her during Sunday services. Before the cancer. Before the empty pew where they used to sit together. The fellowship hall continued filling with an unusual mix of congregants and curiosity seekers. Local factory workers still in their uniforms sat beside retirees in their Sunday best, while campaign staffers in sharp suits hovered anxiously near the exits. The wooden folding chairs creaked under the weight of anticipation, their protests nearly drowning out the hum of the overworked air conditioning unit. Donald Trump's arrival was preceded by a ripple of murmurs and the mechanical whir of phones being raised to capture the moment. He entered without his usual entourage, looking almost diminished under the modest ceiling of the fellowship hall. His red tie seemed out of place against the backdrop of children's Sunday school artwork, construction paper crosses, and crayon drawings of Noah's Ark. Emily clutched the Bible tighter as Trump began his usual remarks. But something was different tonight. His voice, normally filled with its characteristic bombast, seemed to catch slightly when he mentioned visiting a veterans' hospital earlier that day. A crack in the armor, small but noticeable, like the first drop of rain before a Louisiana storm. Rachel squeezed Emily's shoulder, recognizing the subtle shift in her daughter's posture. It was the same determined straightening of the spine she'd seen in her late mother-in-law whenever she'd made up her mind about something. The same quiet strength that had guided their family through loss, medical bills, and the long nights when faith felt more like a question than an answer. The moment for audience questions approached, and Emily's hand rose slowly into the air, her grandmother's Bible balanced carefully in her lap. The gold-leafed pages contained 3 generations of marginalia, prayers, questions, and revelations written in different hands but bound by the same search for meaning. Unknown to everyone in that humid fellowship hall, the next few minutes would transform a routine campaign stop into something none of them had expected, least of all the man standing at the makeshift podium. The idea had taken root 3 weeks earlier, sprouting from the fertile soil of a child's grief. Emily had been organizing her grandmother's Bible study notes, a task that had become her Sunday afternoon ritual since Margaret Carter's passing 6 months ago. Each page held fragments of her grandmother's journey, underlined verses, question marks in margins, and occasional tear stains that made the ink run just slightly. Rachel watched from the kitchen doorway, mechanically folding laundry while the news droned on in the background. Coverage of Trump's upcoming Louisiana visit competed with the rhythmic thump of the dryer's broken bearing, another repair they'd have to postpone. When Emily suddenly looked up from the Bible with that familiar determined expression, Rachel recognized it immediately. It was the same look her mother-in-law had worn the day she'd insisted on driving Rachel to her nursing school entrance exam, despite having started chemotherapy that same week. "Mama," Emily said, her finger tracing a note in her grandmother's elegant script. Grandma wrote here that sometimes the biggest answers come from the smallest questions. She held up the Bible, showing a page where her grandmother had written beside Psalm 8. "Through the praise of children and infants, you have established a stronghold." Rachel set down the unmatched socks and sat beside her daughter at the kitchen table, its scratched surface bearing witness to countless family discussions. "What are you thinking about, baby?" "I want to ask him about God," Emily said simply, her eyes still fixed on her grandmother's handwriting. Not the way the TV preachers talk about him, but the way Grandma did. Like he's right here in the kitchen with us, helping us find the other sock. The practical part of Rachel's mind, the part shaped by 12-hour shifts in the emergency room and endless insurance paperwork, wanted to protect Emily from disappointment. But another part, perhaps the part her mother-in-law had nurtured during their long talks over coffee and scripture, recognized something important taking shape. In the days that followed, Emily crafted her question with the same careful attention she gave to her weekly Bible verse memorization. She practiced in front of the bathroom mirror during car rides to school and while helping Rachel sort medical supplies at the free clinic where they volunteered on Saturdays, another tradition started by Grandma Margaret. The question evolved as naturally as her grandmother's garden had changed with the seasons. What does God mean to you? Simple words carrying the weight of genuine curiosity, untainted by political calculation or adult cynicism. Word spread through their church community about Emily's intention. Some, like Mr. Mitchell from the factory, offered gruff encouragement colored by his own struggles with faith after the plant's downsizing. Others, including Margaret Hayes, named after Emily's grandmother and her bridge partner of 20 years, expressed concern about mixing faith with politics. But most recognized in Emily's question an echo of their own uncertainties, their own wrestling with divine mysteries. Their pastor, Reverend Thompson, had taken Emily aside after Sunday service to share his perspective. Sometimes, he'd said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, God uses the most unexpected voices to cut through all our grown-up complications. He'd glanced at the church bulletin board where Emily's grandmother's influence still lingered in the carefully organized volunteer schedule she'd maintained for decades. The evening before the town hall, Rachel found Emily in her grandmother's garden, now their shared responsibility. She was tending to the rosemary bush, her grandmother's favorite, used in both cooking and impromptu object lessons about faith's persistence through winter seasons. "You know, he might not give you the answer you're hoping for," Rachel said gently, kneeling beside her daughter in the soft Louisiana dirt. Emily nodded, her hands still working the soil. "Grandma always said the best questions don't have easy answers. That's why we keep asking them." She pulled a small weed free, examining its roots with careful attention. "Like these roots, Mama. You can't see them doing their work, but they're still growing underneath." Later that night, as Rachel tucked Emily into bed, she noticed her daughter had placed her grandmother's Bible on the nightstand, a pink post-it marking her intended question. The sight triggered a memory of her mother-in-law doing the same thing before important church meetings, letting the weight of scripture settle into her thoughts overnight. "Grandma would be proud of you," Rachel said, smoothing Emily's hair. "I know," Emily replied with the simple confidence of a child. She always said God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. She paused, then added, "Even if they're only 8. Rachel kissed her daughter's forehead, recognizing in that moment how faith, like family recipes and handed-down Bibles, finds new life in each generation. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. But tonight, in this room still decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars her mother-in-law had helped Emily place, God felt as close as a grandmother's memory. The first questions from the audience followed predictable patterns, like a liturgy everyone knew by heart. A retired school teacher asked about Medicare, her voice carrying the weight of mounting prescription costs. A young father in a mechanic's uniform questioned immigration policies, gesturing with hands still bearing traces of engine grease. Trump's responses came with practiced ease, each answer a familiar blend of promises and populist appeal. From her seat in the third row, Emily observed these exchanges with the careful attention she usually reserved for Sunday school lessons. She noticed how Trump's demeanor shifted subtly with each questioner, firmer with the men, gentler with the elderly women, his famous New York cadence adjusting to match his audience's Southern rhythms. Rachel recognized the same analytical gaze she'd seen when Emily would watch her grandmother navigate difficult church board meetings, reading the room with quiet wisdom. "If you're enjoying tonight's conversation," a campaign staffer interrupted, her voice carrying rehearsed enthusiasm, "please consider following the president's social media channels. Your support means everything as we continue this journey together." The brief interruption created a natural pause, during which Emily felt the rough edges of a paper note in her Bible. She pulled it out carefully, a shopping list in her grandmother's handwriting, transformed into an impromptu bookmark. "Bread, hope, patience," it read, making Emily smile at her grandmother's habit of mixing spiritual and practical needs in her lists. John Mitchell shifted in his seat 2 rows behind them, his work boots scuffing against the linoleum. The factory closure had hit him harder than most, but he still came to church every Sunday, still helped with building maintenance even when the budget couldn't pay him. He caught Emily's eye and gave her an encouraging nod, the same way he did when she helped him organize the food pantry donations. Margaret Hayes, elegant even in her grief, sat near the wall fan that futilely pushed around the humid air. 6 months a widow, she shared more than a name with Emily's grandmother. They'd both faced loss with a quiet dignity that transformed pain into purpose. She'd been teaching Emily to play bridge, carrying on her namesake's tradition of building community one card game at a time. As the questions continued, the atmosphere in the fellowship hall began to shift. The initial formality melted like ice in sweet tea, giving way to something more authentic. A veteran's question about his son lost in Afghanistan cracked Trump's practiced veneer, revealing a flash of genuine emotion that rippled through the room. Emily leaned forward slightly, recognizing what her grandmother would have called a God moment, when pretense falls away and real connection becomes possible. Rachel felt her daughter's movement and squeezed her hand. Their eyes met in silent communication, years of shared understanding passing between them. Emily's other hand still rested on the Bible, its pages warm from her touch. The gold letters on its cover caught the fluorescent light. "To my granddaughter, who knows that the biggest prayers often come in the smallest packages. Love, Grandma, Margaret." Reverend Thompson, standing quietly at the back of the room, watched Emily with thoughtful eyes. He remembered counseling the family through Margaret's illness, watching how faith sustained them even when medical science couldn't. The question Emily planned to ask, which she'd shared with him after Sunday service, reminded him of Jesus' words about children leading the way to truth. The campaign staffers grew increasingly anxious as their carefully orchestrated town hall evolved into something more organic. They huddled near the exits, smartphones glowing as they texted concerns up the chain of command. But Trump himself seemed to be settling into the room's changing dynamics, his responses growing longer, more contemplative. A young mother asked about helping her children navigate an increasingly divided world. Trump's answer, for once, avoided political talking points. Instead, he spoke about his own children, about moments of doubt and discovery. The authenticity in his voice surprised even his staff, who stopped their nervous texting to listen. Emily's hand began to rise, slowly but steadily, like a sunrise over the Louisiana bayou. Rachel held her breath, remembering all the practice sessions in their kitchen, all the prayers whispered over this moment. Around them, the fellowship hall seemed to quiet, as if the very air recognized the importance of what was about to happen. The worn Bible in Emily's lap held more than scripture. It contained her family's history of faith. Tucked between its pages were church bulletins from her baptism, dried flowers from her grandmother's garden, and countless notes in different handwritings, all seeking answers to life's biggest questions. Now, Emily prepared to add her own chapter to that legacy of spiritual seeking. Trump's eyes scanned the room, looking for the next questioner. The Secret Service agents straightened slightly as Emily's hand remained raised, their training kicking in as they assessed this small potential approached. Campaign staffers consulted their prepared list of vetted questions, frowning at this deviation from script. But Emily remained steady, channeling her grandmother's quiet strength. The rosemary sprig she'd pinned to her dress, cut fresh from the garden that morning, released its fragrance with each movement, reminding her of countless lessons learned while tending those herbs with her grandmother. Remember, Margaret had often said, sometimes God's greatest works start with the smallest seeds. In that moment, as Trump's gaze finally met hers, Emily felt the full weight of her grandmother's legacy, her mother's support, and her community's presence. The question she'd practiced so many times was about to transform this political event into something else entirely, a moment of genuine seeking that would remind everyone present of faith's power to transcend political divisions and touch the deepest parts of human experience. "Yes, the little lady in the third row," Trump said, his voice carrying a hint of curiosity. The room's attention shifted to Emily, whose small frame seemed to grow with purpose as she stood, her grandmother's Bible held close to her chest. "Mr. President," Emily began, her voice clear despite its softness, "what does God mean to you?" The simplicity of her question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the fellowship hall. Campaign staffers froze mid-text, their phones temporarily forgotten. The Secret Service agents practiced neutrality wavered for just a moment. Even the old air conditioning unit seemed to hold its breath. Trump's reaction was subtle but profound. His usual rapid-fire response pattern stalled. He looked at Emily, really looked at her, taking in the worn Bible in her hands, the rosemary sprig on her dress, the earnest question in her eyes. For perhaps the first time that evening, he wasn't seeing a campaign stop or a photo opportunity. He was seeing a child asking the kind of question adults had learned to avoid. He started, then paused, an unusual hesitation for a man known for his quick responses. His right hand moved to his jacket pocket where he kept a small photo of his brother Fred. The movement was automatic, unconscious, a tell few would recognize. "That's a bigger question than most adults are brave enough to ask," he continued, his voice losing its rally rhythm. He stepped away from the podium, a move that made his security detail tense slightly. The fluorescent lights caught the silver in his hair as he moved closer to Emily's row. "God," he said slowly, as if testing the word's weight, "wasn't always clear to me." Growing up in New York, success was our religion. Buildings, deals, headlines, those were our measures of worth. He glanced at the Sunday school artwork on the walls, Jesus' simple face smiling from construction paper crosses. But then my brother Fred got sick. The room stilled. This wasn't the usual Trump performance. Rachel felt Emily lean forward slightly, recognizing the authenticity in his voice, something her grandmother had taught her to listen for in testimony meetings. "Fred was the good one," Trump continued, his New York accent softening. "He had this light about him. Faith came easy to him, like breathing." He paused, looking down at his hands. "When he died, I was angry at God, furious. I threw myself into work, into building bigger towers, as if I could reach heaven and demand answers." John Mitchell shifted in his seat, his own struggles with faith after the factory closure reflecting in his eyes. Margaret Hayes dabbed at tears, Fred's story echoing her own loss. The campaign staffers looked increasingly uncertain, their political playbook useless in this moment of raw honesty. "But God," Trump said, now speaking directly to Emily, "he's patient, more patient than I've ever been. He waited while I built my towers, waited while I chased worldly success, and sometimes he sent messengers I wasn't expecting." He gestured to Emily, like 8-year-old girls with their grandmother's Bibles. Emily's face lit up with recognition. Rachel squeezed her daughter's shoulder, hearing her mother-in-law's wisdom echoed in Trump's words. The fellowship hall had transformed into a space of shared vulnerability, political divisions temporarily dissolved by the universal experience of wrestling with faith. "May I?" Trump asked, gesturing to Emily's Bible. She handed it to him carefully, its well-worn pages testament to years of spiritual seeking. He handled it with unexpected reverence, noting the handwritten notes in the margins, the pressed flowers marking favorite passages. "Your grandmother's?" he asked softly. Emily nodded. "She went home to Jesus 6 months ago," she replied, using her grandmother's preferred phrase for passing. Trump nodded, understanding flickering across his features. "Mine was my mother's," he said, reaching into his jacket to pull out a small leather-bound Bible. The room murmured in surprise. This wasn't a prop for evangelical voters, but a personal talisman worn smooth by years of carrying. "I don't read it as often as I should," he admitted, his candor cutting through his usual bravado. "But I carry it to remember something Fred taught me, that sometimes our biggest questions don't need immediate answers. Sometimes just asking them, just carrying them with us, is an act of faith itself." The air in the fellowship hall grew thick with emotion. A campaign staffer started to move forward, perhaps to steer things back to script, but stopped at Trump's subtle headshake. This moment wasn't about politics anymore. "Your question," Trump continued, "about what God means to me. He's become something different than what I once thought. Less like a cosmic CEO demanding performance, more like—" He paused, searching for words that weren't from a speechwriter's pen. "More like the patience in these Bible pages, the love in these margin notes, the faith that keeps asking questions even when answers don't come easily." Emily nodded, her grandmother's teachings about faith being a journey rather than a destination coming alive in this unexpected moment. Rachel watched her daughter's face, seeing the same quiet wisdom that had marked Margaret's expressions during deep discussions over Sunday dinner. "Sometimes," Trump said, his voice carrying to the back of the hall without its usual force, "God speaks loudest through our losses, through the empty chairs at our table, through the questions that keep us awake at night." He looked around the room, seeing heads nod in recognition. "Through the communities that hold us when our own faith feels too small." The fellowship hall had become a sanctuary of shared vulnerability. John Mitchell wiped at his eyes, years of stoic factory worker pride giving way to emotion. Margaret Hayes reached for her neighbor's hand, their shared grief creating bridges of understanding. Even the Secret Service agents seemed touched, their professional distance softened by the universal nature of faith's struggles. "So, to answer your question, young lady," Trump said, carefully returning Emily's Bible, "God means something new to me every day. Sometimes he's in the quiet moments between the chaos, sometimes he's in the faces of people I meet in places like this, and sometimes," he smiled gently, "he's in the courage of a child who isn't afraid to ask the questions we adults have forgotten to ask." Emily beamed, recognizing in Trump's words the same spiritual wisdom her grandmother had shared during their garden conversations. Rachel felt tears prick her eyes, hearing echoes of her mother-in-law's faith in this most unexpected setting. "Would you—" Trump hesitated, showing rare uncertainty. "Would you mind if I shared something your grandmother wrote in here?" He pointed to a margin note that had caught his eye. Emily nodded enthusiastically. "She wrote here, 'Faith isn't about having all the answers, it's about trusting the questions to lead us home.'" Trump read, his voice carrying a respect for the wisdom in those words. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Emily said simply, her voice carrying the pure conviction of a child's love. "She always said that God's best work happens in fellowship halls and gardens, not in fancy buildings." Trump chuckled, a genuine sound free from political calculation. "She sounds wiser than most of my advisors." He looked around the humble room, taking in the folding chairs, the children's artwork, the faces of people carrying their own questions and struggles. "Maybe that's what God really means to me. The wisdom to stop building towers to heaven and start noticing His presence in places like this." The silence that followed Trump's words held its own kind of power. It was John Mitchell who broke it, rising slowly from his creaking folding chair. His calloused hands gripped the chair in front of him, knuckles white with emotion or determination. Perhaps both. "Mr. President," he started, his voice rough with unshed tears, "I've been angry at God, too." The admission seemed to cost him something, like the last of his pride. "Lost my job at the factory 3 months ago. 30 years I gave them, and now—" He gestured vaguely at his worn work shirt, still wearing it like armor. "Been sitting in church every Sunday wondering if God's even listening anymore." Trump turned to face him, campaign persona completely stripped away. The fellowship hall's humble fluorescent lighting cast everyone in the same honest glow: president and factory worker, Secret Service and secretary, all temporarily equal under the weight of shared human struggle. "I remember watching you on TV," John continued, "talking about jobs and success. Thought you couldn't possibly understand people like us, but hearing you talk about your brother, about questioning God." He paused, gathering himself. "Maybe we're not so different after all." Margaret Hayes stood next, her grief-refined dignity drawing all eyes. "My Harold always said God works in mysterious ways," she said, her voice carrying the strength of someone who'd learned to live with loss. "Never thought I'd find comfort in a political town hall of all places." She smiled gently at Emily. "Takes a child to lead us, just like Scripture says." The campaign staffers had long since stopped trying to control the narrative. Their phones documented but didn't direct, capturing something authentic that no focus group could have engineered. One young staffer wiped tears from her cheeks, smearing carefully applied makeup. Rachel watched as others began to stand, each carrying their own stories of faith tested and questions wrestled with in the dark. She recognized Mrs. Chen from the hospital cafeteria, who'd lost her son to cancer last year but still brought homemade dumplings to the nurses' station every Friday. Mr. Rodriguez from the auto repair shop, who'd been teaching ESL classes at the church despite his own struggles with English, rose to share how faith had carried him across borders and through hardships. Emily sat quietly, taking it all in with the same careful attention she'd given to her grandmother's garden lessons. "See how the roots all connect underground?" Margaret had once told her while transplanting herbs. "People are like that too, all connected in ways we can't always see." Trump moved through the room now, his security detail adapting to his unprecedented informal approach. He stopped to listen to each person, not with political patience but with genuine attention. The Bible he'd shown earlier remained in his hand, his finger marking the page where Emily's grandmother's words had struck home. "I've been carrying this Bible for years," he admitted to the room, "but maybe I've been reading it wrong. Been looking for power when I should have been looking for..." He gestured at the scene before him. "This? Community. Real faith. The kind that shows up in fellowship halls and factory lines." A young mother near the back stood, bouncing a fussy baby. "I've been scared," she confessed. "Scared about the world my children will inherit. Scared about paying bills. Scared about..." She looked around the room, finding understanding faces. Everything, really. But being here tonight, hearing everyone's stories, it reminds me of what my grandmother used to say. Fear and faith can't occupy the same space. Reverend Thompson moved from his position at the back of the room, his presence adding weight to the moment. "In 30 years of ministry," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of well-worn hymns, "I've never seen walls between people fall so quickly. This is what the early church must have felt like, people sharing their real struggles, their honest questions." The air conditioning unit kicked in again, its mechanical hum a counterpoint to the human drama unfolding beneath it. The sound mixed with sniffles, whispered amens, and the rustle of Bible pages being turned as people looked up verses that had carried them through their own dark nights of the soul. Emily tugged gently at Trump's sleeve, a gesture so innocent it made several Secret Service agents smile despite themselves. "Mr. President," she said, pointing to a passage in her grandmother's Bible, "Grandma always said this verse is for times like this." Trump leaned down to read where she pointed. "For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there am I with them." He read it aloud, letting the familiar words take on new meaning in this context. "Your grandmother," he said, looking around the transformed fellowship hall. "She understood something I'm just beginning to learn. Real faith, real connection. It doesn't happen in gilded towers or campaign rallies. It happens in places like this, when people are brave enough to be honest about their struggles." Rachel watched her daughter beam with pride, seeing her grandmother's legacy living on in unexpected ways. The rosemary sprig on Emily's dress had been slightly crushed during the evening, releasing its fragrance, a reminder of Margaret's garden, where some of the deepest spiritual truths had been taught between rows of herbs and vegetables. The evening had long since departed from its scheduled timeline, but no one seemed to care. The fellowship hall had become a sanctuary of authentic connection, where political divisions dissolved in the face of shared human experience. Campaign staffers had stopped checking their watches, caught up in the holy ground that can emerge in the most unexpected places. As the evening deepened, the fellowship hall took on the sacred atmosphere of a spontaneous revival. Not the loud, performative kind, but the quiet, transformative type that Margaret Carter had always said came when hearts are ready for tending, like spring soil after winter. Trump had settled into a folding chair in the center of the room, his red tie loosened, his typical bombast replaced by something more genuine. The Secret Service had adapted to this unprecedented scenario, forming a loose circle that protected while respecting the intimacy of the moment. "You know," Trump said, turning Emily's grandmother's Bible gently in his hands, "my brother Fred used to tell me something I never really understood until tonight." He paused, his voice carrying an unfamiliar vulnerability. He said, "Donnie, sometimes God's biggest miracles look like ordinary moments until you're ready to see them." Emily, who had remained remarkably poised throughout the evening, nodded with the wisdom of a child who'd been raised on similar truths. "Grandma called those holy surprises," she offered, "like when you find a flower growing through sidewalk cracks." The room murmured in appreciation, recognizing in her words the kind of unfiltered insight that often comes from the youngest among us. Rachel watched her daughter with quiet pride, seeing how Margaret's spiritual legacy was blooming in unexpected ways. John Mitchell cleared his throat. "Been thinking about something," he said, his voice stronger now than earlier. "All these years at the factory, I measured success by my paycheck. But sitting here tonight..." He looked around the room, at faces that had become more than just neighbors. Maybe true wealth isn't in what we earn, but in what we share. Margaret Hayes reached over to pat his hand, her wedding ring catching the fluorescent light. Harold used to say the same thing about his military service, said the medals weren't nearly as valuable as the brothers he served with. She turned to Trump. "Mr. President, I came here tonight expecting politics. Instead, you've given us permission to be human together." Trump's response surprised everyone, including his staff. "Maybe that's what we've all been missing," he said, running a hand through his carefully styled hair in a gesture of unguarded honesty. "We've been so busy building walls, literal and figurative, that we forgot how to build bridges." Emily stood then, carrying herself with the peculiar grace of a child who doesn't yet know she's doing something extraordinary. She opened her Bible to a page marked with a pressed rosemary sprig, her grandmother's favorite herb for remembrance. "Grandma wrote something here," she said, her small finger tracing the familiar handwriting. She said, "Faith is like my garden. It grows best when we tend it together, share its fruits, and aren't afraid to get our hands dirty with each other's soil." The profound simplicity of this garden wisdom landed deeply in the room. Trump looked at his own hands more accustomed to signing executive orders than working soil, with newfound contemplation. A campaign staffer, moved beyond professional distance, stepped forward. "Sir," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "we're well over schedule, and the next event..." Trump held up his hand, not in his usual commanding way, but with the gentle authority of someone who has found something more important than schedules. "Some moments," he said, echoing the wisdom of Emily's grandmother, "run on God's time, not ours." The fellowship hall hummed with murmured agreement. Mrs. Chen from the hospital cafeteria began softly singing Amazing Grace, her accented English carrying years of faith tested and proven. Others joined in, the hymn rising organically like steam from shared cups of coffee after Sunday service. Rachel watched as Emily swayed slightly to the music, one hand still resting on her grandmother's Bible. The evening had transformed into something Margaret Carter would have called a thin place, where heaven and earth seemed to touch, where political titles and social divisions dissolve in the face of shared humanity. Trump sat quietly, letting the hymn wash over him. For once, he wasn't leading or directing. He was simply present, part of something authentic that no campaign could choreograph. The weight of office seemed to lift slightly from his shoulders, replaced by the lighter burden of genuine connection. "Emily," he said as the hymn faded, "your grandmother's Bible. May I share one more thing she wrote?" At Emily's eager nod, he turned to a dog-eared page. She underlined this verse and wrote beside it, "Remember, the kingdom comes not with observation, but through small seeds of faith planted in humble soil." The word settled over the room like evening dew, nourishing soil that had long been parched for authenticity. Even the Secret Service agents seemed moved, their professional masks softened by the undeniable holiness of the moment. As the evening drew to its natural close, no one rushed for the exits. People lingered, exchanging phone numbers and promises to meet for coffee, sharing their own worn Bibles and favorite passages. The fellowship hall had become holy ground, transformed by a child's question and a community's courage to be authentic. Trump knelt down to Emily's level, Secret Service agents discreetly adjusting their positions. "May I write something in your grandmother's Bible?" he asked. At her nod, he took out a pen and carefully wrote on the last blank page. "Tonight, an 8-year-old taught a president what faith really means. Thank you, Emily." Rachel watched as her daughter traced the fresh ink with her finger, adding these words to her family's legacy of faith. The rosemary sprig on Emily's dress had dried slightly, but its fragrance still carried, just as her grandmother had taught her that God's presence lingers long after the immediate moment passes. As they gathered their belongings, John Mitchell approached with Margaret Hayes. "Emily," John said, his voice gruff with emotion, "your grandmother would be proud. You planted seeds tonight, just like she taught you." Margaret Hayes nodded, adding, "And we'll help tend them, dear. That's what community does." Outside, the Louisiana night wrapped around them like a prayer shawl. Stars pierced the darkness above the church steeple, and crickets offered their evening testimony. Trump paused at his vehicle, looking back at the humble building that had hosted such an unexpected moment of grace. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "I've held rallies in grand arenas, but I've never felt closer to God than I did tonight in this fellowship hall." His words carried no political weight, just the simple truth of a man who had found something he didn't know he was seeking. Emily stopped at the edge of her grandmother's garden, now tended by the church community. The herbs silvered in the moonlight, their fragrance rising like incense. "Mama," she whispered, "I think this is what Grandma meant about holy surprises." Rachel hugged her daughter close, feeling the presence of her mother-in-law in the garden's gentle rustling. The evening had been more than a political event, more than a viral moment. It had been a reminder that faith, like the tiny seeds Margaret Carter had loved to plant, could grow in the most unexpected places and transform the hardest soil. As their car pulled away, Emily clutched her grandmother's Bible, now bearing one more story of faith's quiet revolution. Above them, the church's simple cross stood against the star-studded sky, a reminder that sometimes the biggest answers come through the smallest questions, and that God's work often happens in fellowship halls and gardens, where humble hearts gather to plant seeds of hope. Like Emily's grandmother always said, faith is like planting seeds. You may not see the growth right away, but that doesn't mean nothing's happening underneath. Tonight, in an unexpected moment of grace, those seeds found fertile ground. As we witness this story, remember that your own questions, doubts, and hopes are part of a greater garden. Share them, tend them, watch them grow. If you found value in this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these moments of unexpected grace.